We're going to talk about documentary photography again because it is so important to the history of photography. Documentary refers to a particular style or approach, not merely a recorder nor an artist for art's sake, but a person whose reports are brilliant technically and highly artistic. Documentary images involve imagination and art, and that they imbue fact with feeling. We're looking at Lewis Hines' photography here. He said light was required to illuminate the dark areas of social existence. But how to shine the light and frame the scene are the creative decisions that led to the effectiveness to inform and move the viewer. This particular shot is a hospital inside a mine. These are child miners. Look at the age of these children. Think of what's happening in the world. After World War I, the war to end all wars, it's a golden age for the well-to-do. Not so nice for those left out, like these children sleeping in an alley. For African Americans, the Great Migration is taking place, and many are leaving home in the South for the promise of the work in the North. For children who aren't born well-to-do, it's work in a factory or in a mine at an early age. For women, it's a changing world, but not fast enough. They have no power, they have no vote, they have no help for hungry children. The 20s are golden for some, but the 30s are dismal for most, for nearly everyone. The only thing that pulls the world out of the Great Depression is another world war. These are times of great turmoil. And if you're a family without a lot of money, you're going to put a child in the mine or in the mills. And the mill owners and the mine owners, they didn't have to pay children what they would pay an adult. These are breaker boys. They're looking for specific size coal as it shoots underneath them. Their little backs bent over, and notice all that dust? That's coal dust. These children are 6, 7, 8, 9 years old. He didn't give him names when he took this kind of picture, but when he took this kind of picture after work in the streets, he would name them. Lewis Hines was a trained sociologist. He found the camera was a powerful tool for research and for communication his findings to others. He documented immigrants arriving in New York. He was greatly concerned with the welfare of the underprivileged. Before World War I, he took his camera to Ellis Island to record the immigrants who were arriving by the tens of thousands. He followed them into the unsavory tenements that became their homes, penetrated the miserable sweatshops where they found work, photographed children playing among the trash and the human derelicts sprawled across the slums of New York. He described his work as photo interpretations, human documents. This child is collecting oysters. What do you think? 4, 5 tops. This is piecemeal work. They'll work in the factory, and then they'll take that stuff home to work some more. These children are so small that they have to climb onto those machines to change the bobbins. During the Depression, he photographed workers of all ages in the mines. That's Lewis Hines. He photographed children on the streets. That got cut off pretty badly. He uses a 5x7 camera to show children in factories at their machines. His revelations of the exploitation of children led to eventual passage of child labor laws. These are the immigrant children. Here they are working around the table by lamplight. Just a little poor little urchin. He's bundling up the coats to take them home. Little girls in a laundry. Now, do you know how badly that would mangle your arm? And of course, there was no government policy. If your arm got mangled and you were a child, it's tough. There's Lewis Hine. In the mills. Not all his work was negative. In 1918, he photographed the American Red Cross work in the Middle European countries. He also did another book, which we'll get to here. Notice these kids are on a box. They're so little, they're standing on a box. These are mill workers. There's a mill town, New Hampshire, I believe, that's now a national park. You see how many machines are in there? I went to visit that national park. They had about 4 machines running. It was so loud. They had you put ear protection in with 4 machines running. Can you imagine? Hundreds of machines running? And the dust in the air, it's not as bad as coal dust, but it's going to give you lung diseases as well. These children didn't live that long. These are oyster shuckers. You know how you shuck an oyster? See that little tiny kid? It's done with a big knife. That's a 4-year-old. She shucks 2 baskets a day. See the knife in her hand? Little coal miners, breaker boys. That they're just children. It's astonishing to me that we let this go on in America. And we still let it go on. We still have laws. You can have little children picking that fruit. Shoeshine boys, cranberry bog children, cotton pickers. You know how hard it is to pick cotton? This kid is cutting beets. This is the tool you use to cut beets. Who thinks this is a good tool to give to children? Life was tough. Life was tough. There's Lewis Hines in 1918 at the canteen for the Red Cross in Europe. But he came home and he did a book on the construction of the Empire State Building. 102 stories, the tallest building of its day. He followed the steel upwards. He's using a 4x5 Graflex. He reached the top with the workmen. He had them swing out over the city to drive the final rivet at the very top of the skyscraper. It was a straightforward record of a dangerous job, but it's not really what he's remembered for. What he's remembered for, of course, is he's the man who helped get these babies out of the factories and into a childhood. Documentary is an approach that makes use of artistic faculties to give vilification to fact. In 1935, the U.S. government turned to photographers for help in fighting the Depression. There was the FSA, the Farm Security Administration, the WPA, the Works Progress Administration. There were lots of programs, and they employed lots of photographers. And the mission of the Farm Security Administration was to document rural life in the depth of the Depression. When you look at the ground, it is worn out. And all this work is done by hand. And then you're looking at the mist of the Dust Bowl. And you can talk about it, but until you show pictures of it, I don't think people understood. You had Walker Evans, Dorothea Lange, Ben Shaker, Russell Lee. They're fabulous photographers, and their pictures document life in rural America, and it is heartbreaking. Here they are. Okies off to California. They document the condition of the land, the plight of the tenant farmer, their houses, their belongings, the way they worked, their crops, their schools, their churches, their stores. Some of them used an 8x10 camera. Dorothea Lange left her portrait studio in San Francisco to join the FSA. She said she wanted everyone to see the homeless, the unemployed. She wanted everyone to see and feel the compassion she felt. She photographed migratory workers with overladen jalopies on the highways, working in tent cities, living in transient camps, on the town dumps. She had deep compassion and respect for the downtrodden of this world. Many of them Okies on their way to California. Grapes of wrath here. I have to say, I'm not sure it was entirely a grand thing to do. I think in the depths of the Depression, people weren't having their photographs made anymore. And it was probably a way of staying alive. The government truly employed a lot of photographers, writers, painters, artists. They kept them alive. I can't imagine what they would have done during the Depression. But Dorothea Lange said, my own approach is based on 3 considerations. First, hands off. Whatever I photograph, I do not molest or tamper with or arrange. Second, a sense of place. Whatever I photograph, I try to picture as part of its surrounding, as having roots. Third, a sense of time. Whatever I photograph, I try to show as having its position in the past or in the present. Ben Shahn, the painter, used a 35 millimeter fitted out with a right angle viewfinder so he could photograph people without their knowledge. The FSA lasted 7 years, and it employed many, many great photographers until it was turned over to the Office of War Information during World War II. Margaret Burke White was doing photo essays for the likes of Fortune and Life magazine. She worked mostly out of New York. In 1937, she photographed Muncie, Indiana for an 11-page spread in Life. It showed the city from the ground to shots from the air, from the rich to the poor. It was an unusually graphic cross-section of an American community. New York City. This is not New York City. Beatrice Abbott worked under the WPA, Works Progress Administration. She set out to photograph the metropolis and its spirit. Government programs kept them alive during the Depression. And I have to tell you, if you ever find yourself in Anadarko, Oklahoma, go to the post office. It's a WPA project. It employed some of the Kiowa 5 artists. They were the toast of the world in the teens and the 20s. And they would have starved during the Depression. And the government put them to work, and they painted these fabulous murals in the post office in Anadarko, Oklahoma. And I cannot recommend to you strongly enough that you need to see it. This is apple drying. A funeral in the South. The miners. That's a mining town. That's what a company town looked like. All the houses were the same. You shopped at the company store. They would charge you so much for rent and so much for your goods that you could end up owing more money than you made. Boys looking for coal in the town dumps so they won't be so cold. The largest lead smelter in the country. Notice everything around it is dead. Tobacco. Lambs. Now the next section is all Dorothy Lange. You look at that land and you know nothing's going to grow. And you look at that despair. The only thing shiny in that picture is his badge. I find that picture just heartbreaking. But neighbors still help neighbors. These men are out of work. I find this one of the saddest photographs ever taken. The man is in such despair. The woman is too thin, feeding a baby who's too thin, and he can't do anything about it. It just breaks my heart. Hands that have known nothing but hard work. This woman, this may be her most famous image. She's got 3 children and she is very worried. Nothing's going to grow. And when it does grow, the work is back-breaking. She had a fine sense of irony, don't you think? The camps, the migrant camps. On the way to Oklahoma, on the way to California from Oklahoma. She was a little woman with a strong sense of injustice. Over in Europe, you had Roman Wisniak, and he was documenting a vanishing world. He was always interested in his ancestors. His great-grandparents lived in Russia in the Pale of Settlement. He was Jewish, they were Jewish. Jewish boys were conscripted into the Tsar's army, and his great-grandparents would buy the boys out for the weekend, take them to their home. They taught them how to remain Jews. They risked exile to Siberia, but they persisted. And then Roman, his own activism started when he was 18 during World War I in medical school. Jews in the battle zone were declared spies and deported to the Russian interior in cattle cars with no food or water. No housing once they arrived. He collected money and he tried to save them. Thousands died. Now, these pictures are taken Poland and Russia. That whole area was called the Pale. He was born in St. Petersburg and he lived in Moscow. In 1918, the family moved to Berlin to escape the anti-Semitism spread by the Bolsheviks. Probably in retrospect, not the best move they could have made, but probably the only one they could have made. In 1939, his wife and family moved to Sweden to stay with her parents, but he didn't go yet. So he's living in Germany in the 30s. He knew he was going to not be able to save his people, only their memories. And many of the time out on the street, he was forced to use hidden cameras because the Nazis would have thought he was a spy. They would have had arrested him immediately. Many of the Jews on the street did not trust cameras either. They weren't in the Talmud. Here they are, reading the newspaper that has been put up in the newsstand, so they gather around as soon as it comes out. Shades of thing to come. This is Wisniak's daughter. All this is gone now. The people were murdered. The cities were bombed to smithereens by the Allies. He took over 16,000 images. All but 2,000 were taken and presumed destroyed. He went to Paris in 1940, where he met his parents. They saved the 2,000. He was arrested by the police and interred. He was at that point a citizen of Latvia, which was subsumed by the Soviet Union, and he was considered stateless. And my grandfather was a Latvian too, but he had the good fortune to have gone to England instead of Germany when he fled Latvia and ended up in the United States in the teens. And they saw daylight and they made a run for it, and I've been grateful every day of my life. This man lost his legs in a pogrom led by the Tsar. So his life was pretty tough. So his wife and the JDC, the Jewish Joint Distribution Committee, got him a visa that allowed him to escape to Lisbon, and on to the US he went. His parents remained in hiding in France. Look at the clothes on this man. They shut their stores after Kristallnacht. No one was allowed to trade with the Jews. They shut their stores. They shut them in the ghetto. They starved them. The grandmother is watching the babies as the parents go out to try and find work. It made peddlers out of storekeepers. They used to have a store, now they had nothing. Simple pleasures. Starving children. Old people with nothing to do. Their stores have been shuttered. They have nothing to do. The man on the left is going home. The man on the right has no home, and everything he owns is in that bag. They shuttered their stores so they would stand outside on the street and sell. This man must have been a baker at one time because he's selling fancy bagels. This man's selling metal. Vizhnyak could speak 3 languages, none of them English. Times were tough. In 1946, he gave up portraiture and he went to freelance in photomicroscopy. He specialized in insects. He photographed from inside a firefly's eye, which is a very famous photograph. He photographed blood circulating inside a hamster's cheek pouch. He became a science professor. He taught a course on the philosophy of photography. So he managed to save the pictures of the vanished world, but he could not save his people. He died in 1990. He was aged 92. That's a little Jewish boy hiding behind his Russian friend. And it was cold. In Poland in the winter, it was cold. They started deporting the Jews before they had the camps. And it was the same situation, cattle cars, no place to stay. This man's in hiding. His son's giving him the signal. We have to go look at something a little more cheerful, although this is also a disaster, but it's one of my favorites. This is the photography of Frank Hurley on Shackleton's Antarctic expedition of 1914 to 1917. It's visual proof of the disaster and salvation of this polar expedition. The ship is frozen in the ice. It is eventually crushed by the ice. It's called the Endurance. And it stranded the men on the ice for months. And then, in these little boats, they went on a sea journey to Elephant Island and another to St. George, where they were finally rescued. But some of the men stayed on Elephant Island. This is where they lived. I believe it's 156 days. 23, here they are, of the men, including Hurley, were left. And Hurley, when the ship finally came to rescue him, Hurley got the shot. There he is. He was a professional, dedicated photographer. The photos aren't just a recording of events, they are carefully constructed works of art. He went on other polar expeditions. This one is Manson's. He shot glass plates. This could not have been easy. Many were left behind when they took to the small boats. 400, he smashed them before they got on the small boats. It was the only way he could leave them. But the captain and the crew decided to jettison food and essentials in order to keep some of Hurley's negatives. This is Manson's also. So they'd both been to Antarctica before, Hurley and Shackleton. Shackleton was on the first Scott expedition, and he was sent back from the Polar Try with a case of scurvy and shipped back to England kind of in disgrace, and he never forgave Scott. In Scott's next attempt, he and 4 others perished. They man-hauled to the pole. When they got there, it took 2 months of walking through the worst weather in the world. They found that the Norwegian Amundsen had gotten there first. They found a letter, but he used dogs and he used sleds to get there. It was almost cheating. It was just unmanly. And on the way back, discouraged because they weren't the first, there's Hurley in the Antarctic. They were pinned down by a storm miles from their cache of food and fuel, and they died. Kind of like Custer. They were celebrated as heroes, but they did something so boneheaded and so stupid that they died. Shackleton, on the other hand, on his polar attempt, he reasoned that they couldn't make it to the pole and get back, and he pulled up short and turned around and went back, and nobody died. And on this trip, here's the boat, he took dogs. He took skis, too. He decided that he would cross the continent. That had never been done. He set out in 1914. Just as they were setting out, it appeared the nation was on the verge of war. He offered his ship and the crew, but was refused. So off they sailed to the pole. Now, of course, there's no way to contact them, and no one knew if they were dead or alive. They took 69 dogs, but they were before they ever got to the continent, they were iced in. And that December, they ceased being a ship and became a winter station. You can see the cracks, but they couldn't get the ship out there. So they did a lot of dog walking. They did a lot of football on the ice. Shackleton was very conscious of the crew's well-being, and he didn't let them sit around. There's Hurley, and there's Shackleton. Hurley apparently was fearless. There's one of the early color negatives. There's the library. In the fall of 1915, having been floating for nearly a year, they got free for 100 yards. Then they were refrozen by the flows. And when that happened, it was a little scary. In October 1915, they were forced to abandon the ship because it was about to be crushed, and they took to the ice. Hurley used flares to photograph the ship at night. And in all kinds of conditions. Those are the flows after it got refrozen. You know that's trouble. It was at this point that Hurley was forced to pick the best 150 negatives, and he destroyed the 400 others. He saved 24 color negatives. They were the Paget color plates. After this, he packed his big cameras into cases and welded them in, and he used a small folding vest pocket Kodak. They found a whole pack of undeveloped images in the Antarctic. And I think it was from this expedition, but I'm not positive. Pretty recently, and they developed them. You can find them on the internet. They're absolutely fabulous. There's that break. They actually got out there with axes and tried to move the ship, but it just wasn't happening. And when it refroze, it tilted it over, and the orders were given, and they took to the flows with everything they had that they could carry. And everything was always wet. Here's one of the boats. They constructed 3 small boats from the lifeboats that they had. And at this time, they're moving from floe to floe, and they were shooting the dogs for food. April 19th, 1916, 156 days on the ice, their floe split, and they took to these boats. For 5 days, with no food, nothing to drink, and no sleep, they sailed until they sighted Elephant Island, and all were saved. And this is pretty amazing. They were using sextants to navigate. This is the middle of the ocean, and it's always gray down there, and they only got one sighting. It truly was a miracle. They thought that they'd dig into the glacier, but it turns out if you dig into a glacier and make a room, your breath and the heat causes it to drip all the time. And so they lived under the boat. Shackleton decided that he would sail one whaleboat, barely bigger than a dory, to South Georgian Island, over the world's worst sea. He asked for volunteers and got more than he needed. 5 of them set sail 800 miles away. There they go. And Hurley is recording it. Look at, it's tiny. And like proper Englishmen, it's hip, hip, hurrah. And then it was just them and the penguins. 17 days later, they arrived on the wrong side of the island. There's where they lived. There's the men again. So they have no food, no tents. They're skinny as they can be. They're in rags. And the boat can go no farther, and they're on the wrong side of the island. So 3 of them, 2 of them can't make it. 3 of them leave for the 26 miles over the uncharted mountains with no tents or food. 36 hours later, they arrive at the whaling station. Dogs bark, women scream, children run away. They walk into the whaling station, and the man, the Stromners, was the captain of the station, and he growls at them, "Who the hell are you?" thinking them drunken whalers. And when Shackleton said, "My name is Shackleton," Stromers started to weep because he knew Shackleton and he did not recognize him. So they got a ship and they saved the two left on the other side of the island. There was no way to rescue those on Elephant Island from St. George. So Shackleton went to Chile. He outfitted a boat. It was turned back. The Chilean government offered the Yelcho, the only available boat. 5 months after he left those men on Elephant Island, they were near starvation. They were out on the beach. They were shelling limpets. They were served with seaweed boiled into a jelly when they spotted the ship. And of course, Hurley and his camera was there. Shackleton arrived. He arrived with cigarettes and tobacco, and within an hour, they were all gone. And it was back to the Penguins. And this is a shot of St. George. This is what they went over. It's said that they saw it. It was about 2,000 feet down the mountain. They saw it. They were spent. They were done in. The three of them sat down. One locked his legs around the other, who locked his legs around the other, and they slid down the last 2,000 feet into the town. They arrived in Chile September 3rd, 1916, and were met by hundreds of people on the pier. Shackleton, it was a glorious failure. It was front page news. He might have failed in the mission. This is Hurley, by the way. But he had returned with all his men alive. There was another ship that was to meet the party on the other side of Antarctica, the Aurora. They were to lay depots of food and fuel, which they did. There were 10 men ashore when the boat was ripped from its moorings and cast adrift by a storm. It limped into port, not having been able to get back to the stranded men. They ventured out, laying the depots in conditions like Elephant Island. 2 men did die on that part of the expedition, and they were rescued by Shackleton in the refitted Aurora on January 1917, and that is the end of this story.